So first, I want to say good morning, everyone. My name is Tony. I work for a company called Security, and we've been in the website security business for a little bit now. And so what I'm going to share with you guys today is some of our thoughts and opinions on how to think about security. And I'm going to be upfront. I know that this is a Joomla event, but the way I approach security is websites as a whole, because what we've learned is that Joomla is no different than any other CMS, no different than any other web technology that's out there. The platforms are exactly the same in terms of structure and what they depend on, and security is completely agnostic to the technology. Security doesn't care if it's Joomla, doesn't care if it's WordPress, doesn't care if you're in a Linux box or an Nginx box. So with that, bear that in mind. And so it might be a little bit different than what you're used to having conversations about, where we kind of get into basic tips and things like that. And I'm going to have more of a holistic kind of approach to thinking about security, bringing in some of the more integral parts of security that we don't normally discuss. Hey guys, how's it going? So with that, let's get started. One thing I want to talk to is that although you're all here for Joomla, the reality is that a lot of your environments or experiences probably transcend a number of platforms and technologies. You may be supporting your clients, or you may be developing, or you may be running multiple platforms for different needs, because there are different applications out there to support various needs, whether it's e-commerce, whether it's blogging, whether it's a normal site. And so what you might find in your environment is a Joomla install, but a Magento install, or a WordPress install, or an OS Commerce install. And all these applications within the same environment are potential attack vectors or points of entry to your environment. And so you need to be thinking about that. You can't just think single-mindedly around one application. So before we get going into my main discussion, I obviously want to give my helpful tips, things that you would expect to see in any security conversation, right? You got to update. You got to have secure connections. You need to look for the default permissions. You need to be looking at the val and ensuring you're staying up to date with the extension list, the vulnerability extension list in Joomla, right? This is all stuff we should know. Right? A basic search on Google will find this for you in the first 5 pages, and regurgitation of the same exact information over and over and over again. Right? I don't really want to talk about this. I don't have an issue with these tips. I think that they're helpful, and I think that they're insightful. But I think that it makes us and turns us into lazy web administrators, right? Because we don't truly understand what's happening. We're simply doing what other people have told us, and they're only telling you what to do based on the things that they've heard other people say. So to address this, we're going to kind of dive from a different perspective. Before I get started, though, I want to tell you a little bit of a story. Recently, I was having a conversation with the marketing team that I work with. And in that conversation, we were talking about a number of things, fonts and designs and how people engage and stuff like that. And this image came up. And at first, I looked at this image, and I was kind of taken aback. I didn't really know what it was that I was looking at. And it turns out that this is actually a grocery store. And I didn't get that at first. When I first saw it, my sensories were being overloaded. And there's an idea, a concept known as sensory overload, or the idea that there's so much information coming to you that you just can't make sense of it initially. I fear this is where we're at in website security. I fear that sensory overload is a problem for us, because every day we see online a new compromise, new data exfiltration, new vulnerability. And for the layman, for the everyday website owner, how do you make sense of that? How do you understand what that really means and what you need to apply to your environment? That's a challenge, and it really concerns me. And the reason it concerns me is because when I start looking at what the real problem is in any application, whether it's Joomla, WordPress, Drupal, it always comes down to one thing. The biggest vulnerability we have is ourselves. We are our biggest weakness. It's not the code. It's not the application. It's not the configurations we have. It's every one of us as individuals. We're so inundated. We've taken what people used to have teams to do with their NOCs and their SOCs and the web administrative teams, and we've reduced it down to one individual. And we said, no, it's easy. Open source technology allows us and gives us the freedom to get online. It doesn't give us the freedom to stay safe. That same freedom will be abused. And so we deploy it, and we pay very little emphasis or attention to the technology stack that we're deploying or our environments, which then leads to compromises, right? Very rarely is it because of anything else other than what we as individuals failed to do. So I want to start with the how. because I think this is very important. I categorize the how or how things are being compromised in 4 distinct groups. First and foremost is access control. How do you log in to your environment? In Joomla, you log into administrator, right? Your username and password. That's but one access point. How about the access point to your cPanel or your administrative panels? How about the access to the server directly? How about the access to any other applications in that environment? It's not as simple as putting 2-factor authentication on the administrator control. You have to think beyond that. You have to think of the environment as a whole. And so we look at things like abuse of poor user password management configurations, brute force attacks, the continuous attempt of bombarding your administrator panel trying to get in. Yes, it's rudimentary, but it works. It's been happening for 20 years on the network side, and it's just moved into the layer 7 stack. Then we move into the environment. I've already started to talk about how do we think beyond the application that we're supporting and think of the environment as a whole. We have to look at things like cross-site contamination, poor functional isolation. We have a web server, not even looking at the applications we leverage on that web server. We have other services on that web server. Perhaps we're running FTP on that server. Perhaps we're running a file server on that server. We might be running a database server. We may be using it as an email server. So our sites get compromised, and they're used to spam other users. It's a different form of infection. We have poor functional isolation. In other words, we're not restricting the use of our environments for their purpose. If it's designed to be a web server, use it as a web server. Don't use it as a print server or a file server or a database server or an email server or any other server you can think of other than the function which it was designed for. Software. We can't have a security conversation without looking at the software vector, or specifically the vulnerability of code. But understand that it's not as simple as saying, oh, there's a SQL injection in there. Oh, there's an object injection there. Sometimes it's not a vulnerability in and of itself, but it's a daisy chain of bugs, different defects in the code that create one major vulnerability. Maybe there's a default bug that allows me to do row escalation that then later leads to object injection, or maybe a remote file inclusion. Software vulnerabilities is a very serious thing, and it happens. And it's why we have to make sure we implement good maintenance, good controls to update. The challenge I see in Joomla specifically is that we have a very big problem with upgrades, more so than a lot of other applications. Drupal is another one. Backwards compatibility breaks when we release new versions. That creates a world of pain. There are still users out there running on 1.5, 1.6 because they don't have the resources in-house to build or upgrade because everything will break, or they don't know who to engage for that. That's a problem. Backwards compatibility is important. The last thing is awareness. Again, back to the people aspect. We like to think that in security it's all about the technology, and I'm going to get into that in a second. But people is a critical element of security. If we are not investing in ourselves to understand the various pieces of security and moving beyond the top 10 tips and looking at the environment holistically, we will never help ourselves. And so we have to look at things like education, better risk management, and we have to better manage our sensory overload. How do we account for the amount of information that we're getting on a daily basis in security? How do we decipher the noise from the real information that we need to be paying attention to? The second thing I want to talk to is how these attacks happen. Because every phase of an attack has something that we can learn from. And we have to understand that a majority of the attacks that we as consumers, this is what it really is, experience are mostly automated. As much as we'd like to think that somebody has it out for us, that isn't the reality in most instances. And so we look at attack sequences. The first step in almost any attack sequence, regardless of what the attack is, whether it's a target of opportunity or whether it's a targeted attack, which are two fundamental things or differences, is a reconnaissance phase. And this could be automated. In other words, what is this individual using? Is it a Joomla installation? Are they running other services on that environment? Are ports open on the server that I can abuse? Are there other installs that they've forgotten, which happens all the time? We then go into an identification process. Hey, he's using Joomla. Perfect. Is he susceptible to the latest SQL injection vulnerability that was just patched a week ago? Does he have extensions in that environment that we can abuse? Again, a phase that can be automated. And then we perform the attack. Then we perform the exploitation. We abuse whatever that vector was. Whether somebody was using admin password as their administrator panel, whether somebody had unsecure FTP, whether they had cPanel that was unsecure, whatever the case may be. We then attack that, we exploit it. But then once we exploit it, we have to make a decision. Because it's not always about distributing malware. It's not always about defacements. Maybe it's the inclusion of your environment into my larger network that I can then use for larger botnet attacks. Maybe it's for the distribution of spam in the use of phishing lures, where I can attack larger organizations and networks. And the final phase that most people don't think about and pay very little mind to, is the sustainment phase. Again, something that can be automated. So I've identified what you have. I've exploited you. I've decided what I want to do with your environment. But now I have to make sure that whatever you do, I can make sure I can get back into that environment and compromise you again. So you go through, you remove all the infections. I'm good. I removed the infections. I added my two-factor authentication. I changed all my permissions. I changed my prefix for the database. I changed my default admin ID. I am set. And then you get infected again. And you think, what? I don't understand what happened here. It's because we didn't think about that final phase of sustainment. And this is in the forms of backdoors. So let's get into the why now. This is a very common question that I get from customers around the world. Why me? Why do these guys do what it is that they do? Now, I just briefly spoke to this. I briefly spoke to the concept of opportunistic attacks and targeted attacks. When we talk about the why, it really comes down to four very simple things. Of course, it's the revenue side. There's money to be had by either owning your resources that I can then use for a network. There's a lot of booter services that I want to attack this domain. If your resources are within their stack, they can then use that to mass attack other people. Okay? There's money in phishing lures. In phishing lures is the ability to go out and steal your credentials. Say, hey, I'm from PayPal. Please submit your information. I need your address. I need your username. I need your name. I need your mother's maiden name, whatever. I need your city, all that information. That stuff is valuable, personal identifiable information. Okay? Maybe it's to distribute malware on your site. And every single time I distribute, I'm able to install a Trojan on your machine that, again, allows me to make money. So revenue is the most obvious piece of this, okay? Making money. We're all incentivized by that. The second piece is audience. And audience is very closely tied to revenue. Sometimes it's not about distributing. Sometimes it's about abusing your SEO. Right? You have people that come to you. Why would I invest any energy in building out my audience when you've already done all the work? All I have to do is gain access to that. And the search engines will give me the credit for whatever you've done. They'll push your page rank, your domain authority, over to my domain if I can just get the right links in there. Okay? The lulls. Why not? Right? I'm sitting there, I'm Googling it up, and I see you have a vulnerable version, and I see that SQL injection patch we just pushed, and I say, I always wondered what the SQL injection thing was about, right? And so you try it, and SQL injection works, and you're like, I can see their database. That's pretty cool. But what fun is that? What fun is it just to do that? Let me show them that I did it, right? Let me make them really feel it. I wanted to make sure they know I was here. So I just destroy the server. And then you feel good about yourself. You don't really think about the individual, right? Maybe you just RMRF, just remove the site and be like, recover from that, right? Leave them a little index file like thumbs up, right? The last piece is the resources. I've talked about this a couple times now, right? Your resources, the server itself, are just as valuable as the site itself. The ability to abuse that server and use it for something else. So we've talked about the how, and we've talked about the why. Okay? Okay, cool. We're on the same page. We even talked about the top 10 tips. We all feel good about ourselves, right? Now I want to talk a little bit more about security, right? and how I want you to think about security. The first thing we need to understand that security is about risk management. Okay? It is not about risk elimination. And risk will never be zero. I can never tell you that you will never get hacked. I can tell you that we will improve your knowledge and reduce your overall risk by applying a few simple things. We're going to think of security as an onion. Okay? Multiple layers. And that is a concept known as defense in depth. A concept in which you apply multiple controls throughout your entire stack. And all those controls improve your overall posture. Because security, to me, is about good posture. Good posture reduces risk. So let's look at the composition of security. People, process, technology. That has always been. Yet, where do we put all our energy into? Technology. We look for the latest tools. We look for the latest configurations. We look for our helpful top 10 tips, right? And we apply them. And then we say, we're good. I did my job. I am secure. But what we've forgotten is that security is built up on 3 pillars: people, process, and technology. And technology is nothing without the people. We've seen all these major compromises happen over the past 24 months. Do you really think that Sony did not invest in the latest and greatest technology? Do you really think that Target did not invest in the latest and greatest technology? And when you look at the reports on what happened, it always comes down to the same thing. Oh, we weren't monitoring it. Oh, we were supposed to configure it to look for that? I thought I just paid for it and installed it and it was set. Oh, security evolves? The attacks evolve and the threats evolve? There's a concept. And so the people is the critical piece to our security. It's a revolving cycle, and all of them work in conjunction with one another. And what I like to tell people is that even on our sites, when we deploy the latest technologies, nobody knows more about your site than you as the individual. Case in point. Unless you configure a rule that says somebody logging in at 2 a.m. from the US when I'm in India, the tool will never know that. But you as an individual that logs in, and hey, maybe you're logging all access, and you log in one day and you say, oh, that's really weird. I was sleeping, and somebody logged in from the US, but I'm in India with my username, with my password. That's odd. That should be an indicator of a compromise. The tool saw it, it flagged it, but maybe you didn't configure it. Maybe you didn't think to add that rule in there. But you as an individual know your environment. Know that that shouldn't be there. Maybe a post is published, and you get an alert, hey, a post was published. The technology may or may not know if it's good or bad, but you as the individual know, like, hey, I write about children's books. Why am I posting about Viagra? You know that. The technology doesn't. And the technology is only as useful as how you configure it. And if you configure it incorrectly, it'll inundate you with information. Where, again, sensory overload, we won't be able to make sense of the information. And so we have to tune it to our specific needs. So when we talk about people, we're looking at the awareness, the education of those people. We're looking at the guides and the controls. Maybe the control is every day I wake up and I look at the last 24 hours to see who's logged in with any user that has administrator. That's a basic process. I log in, I look, basic steps to take. Again, though, the process by themselves are useless, just like the technology, if the people don't do it. And then, of course, the technology side. There's very little to say here because this is what we all focus on. The tools, the systems, the configurations were set, right? Now we just have to continue to maintain them and administer them. And so I talked about this, about security being about good posture. And I want to lead into with the tenets of security, at least the way I see it. Okay? When we talk about security, we look at things like protection. How am I protecting my environment? How am I ensuring that these brute force attacks are failing? How am I ensuring that I'm protecting against myself from vulnerabilities? But then we look at detection, because protection by itself is nothing. Say you apply a firewall to your environment, but say one of the other things in your environment get compromised and they act as the entry point. Well, they just bypass your firewall. If you're not monitoring and looking at and continuously checking the security state of your environment, how do you know? You can't fully depend on that one stack. Again, remember, it's multiple layers, multiple controls. And so you're continuously looking and seeing, hey, has anything changed in my DNS? Has anything changed in my whois? Am I maybe serving up some SEO stuff that I shouldn't be serving up? Is my site down? All potential indicators. Is my site throwing errors? Because sometimes attackers, when they inject, they do it incorrectly. And they'll do it where it conflicts with your environment. And those conflictions will throw 500 errors. And those 500 errors could be indicators of a potential compromise that was improperly done. So is that happening? And then response. Do you have something in place that say your protection fails, and say your monitoring says there's a problem? What do you do then? Most of us never really thought about that. We just thought we were good. Our host takes care of that. But do they? Have we ever asked that question? The last thing is maintenance. For whatever reason, we have come to the conclusion that once we set our environment up, we're set. There's nothing else required. But we're wrong. The site being set up in 5 minutes is the least of your concerns. It's a lifetime commitment. It's a responsibility. We just heard that in the keynote. Not just from a community standpoint, but from a management of your environment standpoint. And then best practice. Things like defense in depth. Things like least privileged. Do you give administrator access to every individual that has access to the environment? Why? I highly doubt anybody's actually doing any real administration. So let's think about that. What roles can we implement better? Give somebody the access they require to do their job. Nothing more, nothing less. If they need something that's higher, you give them that. When they're done, we remove it. Again, good maintenance coupled with good policies. And I leave it with this point. There are no absolutes in security. I recently wrote an article on this on my personal blog on Perez, in which I talked to this very point about people, process, and technology. And the fact that the biggest weakness we have in the world of website security is that we're always looking for that absolute. We're always looking for that turnkey solution, that solution that says, we're set, we require nothing else. But unfortunately, that does not exist. I've given you guys 10 questions to ask yourselves. Ways to help think about your security posture. What will your host do if you're compromised? Did you know that in the majority of cases, your host will disable your site? What then? Do you really want to wait till that day to happen? Because you know when that's going to happen, right? That's going to happen the day that you're doing your major release. That's going to happen the day you push out your shopping cart. That's going to happen the day that you're requiring and you're expecting 20,000 visitors, and your site will be down for 48 hours. And you will be upset at everyone else but yourselves. Do you have a plan when an incident occurs? How do you protect against these various vectors? We've talked about how this happens. How do you look at your environment? How do you look at the applications within that environment? How do you look at your access control of your software or even your awareness? Do you even know if you're compromised right now? But then again, the question is, does it matter if you're compromised right now? Maybe some of you say, I don't care. And some of you might say, I don't care because you don't know that you're compromised. And then you know you're compromised and you realize you're being blacklisted, then all of a sudden you'll care a lot. And you're like, oh crap, I'm getting no traffic. That sucks, right? All of a sudden when your domain's blacklisted and nobody's getting your email campaigns or your marketing initiatives, then you'll realize how much you care. So take these questions home, think about that. Figure out what is applicable to me. Because again, it's all about risk management. And your risk tolerance might be higher than someone else's. You might be like, yeah, I'm okay if it goes down. I'm okay if it goes for 48 hours. But you know what? At least you've asked yourself these questions, And you've started to look at it from a risk management perspective and from a good posture perspective. And this is one of my quotes that I like to tell people. Security is not a singular event or action. It begins with good posture. But good posture is attained through appropriate risk management. And risk is appropriately managed through layered defense model. The responsibility starts and stops with every one of you. And with that, my name is Tony. This is my business partner, Daniel. We've started security back in 2008, or 2010 actually. The product started in 2008. And so we've been doing this for a while. And we dabble in all applications, which is why I talk from this perspective. We do WordPress, Magento, Joomla, the whole 9 yards. So I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, that was my 30-minute mark. How was that? I hope I didn't yell too much, right? I had to bring it down because we're in a smaller room, right? Usually when it's a big room, I have to like project. And people are like, why is he yelling at us? So in any event. So with that, I think we have 15 minutes. I'll open it up if you have any questions. Yeah.
So in organizations where you have multiple people who are building various pieces of the website or multiple websites, one of the challenges always that we face is how many extensions and so on under the software part of your people into this software. What extensions do you install, set up? What happens if people try something out, doesn't work? Because do you need a process to keep uninstalling? Do you keep a minimum set of extensions? Because there's so many and you don't know where.
Yeah, and that's the thing, and that's actually common across all platforms. His question is, he has multiple people engaged in his project, and there's so many extension modules and plugins that we can configure. What process or control should we be looking at to manage that process? Okay, two things I would say to that, right? And I think that it's difficult based on the size of your organization. The smaller you are, the more difficult it is, right? We have to learn to reduce access. Even in my organization, we reduce access dramatically. And we have a staging environment and a production environment. I think that to say that there's any set number of extensions or plugins is very difficult because every application is different. Every application has different requirements. And so I would say that when you're designing your application, you should have in your mind a set number of functionalities that you need to be able to support. And that will be supported through these 5 extensions. And those become part of your core package for that site. Anything above that is a nice to have. And so you have to define that. What is my requirement? What do I absolutely need? And what are the things that I don't? And the things that I don't need to go through a process, a control process, right? They go into your staging environment. Somebody should approve that. But very few people should touch your production environment. Once it's deployed, 1 or 2 people, max. And you should actually never really touch that production environment. Most of it should be automated. Nobody should really be logging into that environment. And so when you get to your staging environment, you figure it out. You approve it. Does it make sense? Does it not? You test it. Does it work? And then you move it to production. The reality is, though, that that's not necessarily how it works. Everything is done in production. Your staging box is your production environment. All you have is a separate install, and it's all happening in there. And that is horrible. Again, functional isolation. So I think that when it comes to processes and controls, I'm very lax. I like to look high-level processes that give us flexibility, because I don't like to implement controls that will restrict us. So I like to say, you have to depend on the size of your organization. If you can afford, both from a resource, from people and money perspective, to have a separated environment, I would do that. I would establish a base for your application. This is the core, on top of the core of the application, that must belong in production. And that gets maintained, and you have a process for that. Anything above that should go through an approval process to get into production. Who's going to be the final sign-off? And you should not be shaking it off in the production environment.
When you say code, you mean the default packages comes we assume that's tested and that's safe and so.
So say Joomla install, right? And then you need key features above and beyond the core of Joomla. Maybe it's 3 plugins or extensions. You add those, and that becomes the core of your web application. That becomes your known good. Anything above that gets flagged as a
that maybe an HTA access file could help, but we know that there's a lot of log extensions and also a back server configuration. So, can you give a map of the different layers that a website owner could need to know and care about security?
So his question is specifically on HT access and its use, right? So HT access is something we've been using for a very long time as an additional control. It allows us to control accessibility to that site, right? Whether I deny access to it, whether I can put rules in there to block vulnerabilities, things like that, right? It can be effective. It can also be ineffective, right? Depending on how it's configured, the way it's deployed.
And again, to his point around the servers. And so the biggest recommendations that I've been giving to a lot of individuals these days, because of the point of sensory overload, is that while you can deploy technologies on your server, application firewalls like ModSec or some of the other ones, the latest trend we're seeing is the deployment of SaaS-based application firewalls that manage and do virtual hardening and patching for you at the edge, that are looking at all the incoming traffic and stripping that out. That's one very effective control. And the reason for that is because where HT access falls short is the ability to update itself. It requires an individual to update it. So say you go and you block 10 IPs. Well, you just missed 9,098 of them, right? Because when large attacks happen, they happen in the tens of thousands. And you start adding that to your file, and every single time it has to render on every request, that starts to become problematic for your resources. And then a lot of people do the mistake of deploying application firewalls on the same server. But in reality, you should separate that. Again, functional isolation. Because what happens? You can denial of service yourself. You put it on the same environment, that application gets overwhelmed. Well, guess what? That's going to overwhelm all the resources. And your web application is leveraging those same exact resources, right? So that's problematic. And so we look at things like application firewalls is the big thing that we're looking at these days, specifically to stay ahead of the software issues. Because the software issues is by far one of the bigger problems that everyone is having. Things like SQL injection, the inability to patch fast enough, or the inability to upgrade or patch at all. Because smaller organizations, it's really easy to patch if they're in the same stack, same version. But larger organizations, the more valuable websites, it's a lot harder. You want to talk about processes and controls, it'll take them 3 months to apply a patch. Okay? Does that help?
Yeah, maybe my question was more related to the different layers a website administrator has to take care about, because the website administrator only see the high level of the iceberg. They don't see cPanel, they don't see software version, they don't see the lot of the layers. That's why my question about the different layers.
Well,
So are you asking specifically what they can do with those different layers? Like at the database layer or at the network layer?
Maybe have a map about what are that different layers. Because maybe as a website user, I don't know those different layers.
let me see here. I think I have some.
Something that might help. Give me 1 second here. I have a slide that I did for another event in which I talk specifically to this. I talk to the complexity of the environment, everything from SSH in that environment to the database to any of the modules like cPanel and WHMCS and stuff like that. I don't know. Are there any other questions that I can try to answer while I look for this? Yes.
What do you think about CSF? Like when we talked to our hosting provider, they told us install the CSF on Linux. It will help a lot.
What is it?
CSF, that is firewall. Like my hosting provider always suggests us that use CSF. CSF is a kind of firewall using for Linux environment.
Yeah,
I heard about that.
There's so many, right? There's so many technologies out there. I couldn't talk specifically to one or the other. I'd have to look at it, to be honest with you.
Do you think that if I install any firewall on Linux, it will help help us in.
Absolutely. It'll help you a lot more than what you have now, which is probably nothing, right? So something is always better than nothing. How its effectiveness is going to come down again to the people, right? So for instance, I get a question a lot about configuration and installation of firewalls, and I say, okay, is that my cue?
The last list, long list.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, to take a picture.
That one?
Yeah.
Questions to ask yourself? So again, to your point about the firewall, right? It's not enough just to install it, and that's the mistake people do. So people will take mod security and they'll install mod security and they'll say, I'm safe, right? But that's wrong, right? Mod security not only does it require the configurations, it requires maintenance and upkeep and configuration of the rules. So the question I would ask for you is like, so yes, CSF would be a great configuration for your environment as a firewall if you have the people to maintain it, if you have the people to update it and keep the signatures current. Do you have a team of folks that are managing and looking at the threats and saying, oh wow, they're moving into this direction, or oh wow, this type of encoding is bypassing the firewall, right? If you have that, then absolutely, deploy it internally and have all the fun you want with it. Does that answer your question? Somewhat? Kind of, yeah. Let's see here. Any other questions that I can help answer?
With a follow-up, are there any key extensions of Joomla itself which you would recommend as for security that it makes sense to have these 3 extensions which are
The big
tested
thing,
and tried out?
I've never been a big fan of extensions or plugins in any application, right? The biggest thing that I would look at is, for Joomla specific, is two-factor authentication on your access control. That's by far the one thing that I pay a lot of attention to. Everything else, like prefix configuration or removing admin ID, I don't pay that much mind to it, right? If I'm doing things like whitelisting the IPs that I can access my admin control, or applying two-factor authentication, everything else is moot to me. Make sense? So for me, it's about less is better, right? Not more. And so I actually configure very, very little. I do everything at the server level, right? Things like I modify the permissions where www is not writable to it, the application is not writable to itself. So I do manual installs on the server. That by itself is key. The other thing I do is kill PHP execution and uploads via HT access, where I stop all execution of PHP. Right? Why? Because nothing needs to execute PHP in uploads. And it's the one area where arbitrary file uploads get abused the most, because it allows uploads. Right? So they upload a PHP file, and they're like, awesome. And so you allow PHP in that directory, and guess what? Now they execute their backdoor from the uploads because you allowed uploads, because that was the design that you were hoping to achieve, or the functionality you were hoping to service. So I kill PHP execution, I enable two-factor authentication, I whitelist IP access to my access control, but then I also deploy a firewall at the edge beyond the application. I don't configure it at the application layer. Make sense? Any other questions? Awesome. So with that, I think I'm done, guys. So enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much for coming here. I was a little sad when there was only a few of us, but now all of you showed up. And then Carlos, I'm going to keep looking for that slide. Carlos, I'm going to keep looking for that slide talking about the stacks.
Okay.
And with that, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.